Hi, you're watching Hindustan Times. I'm Aditi Prasad, and I would like to welcome today my friend all the way from Moscow, Vasily Kashin, senior research fellow at the High School of Economics in Moscow. He's going to weigh in on the new strategic dynamic of China-Russia ties in view of the Ukraine war. According to reports, the Biden administration is now considering releasing intel showing how China is weighing options to supply weapons to support Russia's war in Ukraine. Chinese Premier Xi Jinping is also expected to visit Russia in March, April. Now, the Ukraine conflict looks to be escalating to the next level with a direct confrontation between China and Russia on one side and Ukraine and the US-led NATO alliance on the other. Now, I want to start straight away with you, Mr. Kashin. We are in the middle of it's the second year, or rather the first year of the war. It's 1 year of the war which has been completing. Putin was in Beijing to attend the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympic Games barely 3 weeks before he launched the special military operation in Ukraine last year. That was in February of 2022. Today, 1 year later, the China Russia tango seems to be even more firmly entrenched. The warmth of the Russia and China relationship is actually on display in the Kremlin as we speak, where President Putin held talks with China's top diplomat Wang Yi yesterday and hailed the importance. How do you see the Russia-China strategic partnership playing out in the context of the crisis in Europe?
Well, thank you very much. I believe that during this military conflict, China played a very important role helping Russia to stabilize the economy and overcome some of the industrial difficulties which were caused by the Western sanctions. Chinese were providing industrial equipment, certain types of materials for various Russian industries. And of course, Russia managed to ramp up exports to China. In 2022, Russia actually ran trade surplus with China, which amounted to $38 billion, while the bilateral trade volume was $190 billion. So economically, China played a tremendous role. As for the military, I'm still not convinced that China is really considering to sell lethal weapons to Russia. It's not the first time when United States are making such claims referring to some intelligence information. There have been a number of cases when Americans made such statements at the early stage of the military conflict. In the first couple of months, there was a number of such statements from the Chinese side that from the US side, that China is actually very close to selling some weapons to Russia, etc. That never materialized. So we can see that now in the recent months, there have been like new progress in China-Russia relationship. But that progress is mostly represented by new Chinese political statements, which are becoming more and more pro-Russian, and expansion in economic cooperation. And I expect that the Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Russia, which is likely to happen in late March or in April, will bring us new important contracts. I still have my doubts about China's intention to sell lethal weapons to Russia, but if that happens, that of course will be a complete game changer, because
I'm going to stop you there for a minute. I will come to why it will be a game changer, but to address your concerns about whether or not, Blinken himself referred to it in a media interview. I mean, it's unlike Blinken to actually come out in the open and talk about what he told Wang Yi, the Chinese representative there. He spoke to him, the US Secretary of State, and he told him in uncertain terms that we have credible intel that you are in the process, or mulling supplying, and you are, weapons to Russia. On the other hand, he also went out and spoke to the media after that, and we're now hearing reports that the Biden administration is considering releasing intel showing how China is weighing the option to supply weapons to support Russia's war in Ukraine. How do you view that? Would Blinken say something like this just for scaremongering?
The previous US statements about China selling weapons to Russia were also made by relatively high-ranking members of administration, or at least by official representatives. I believe that time in like spring 2022, these were representatives of Pentagon probably, but there was a number of such statements. Anyway, Blinken is actually risking nothing, because if the arms sales don't materialize, then American diplomats will just take credit for it, that they prevented it. If the sales materialize, they will say that they warned everyone. So I have my doubts. It's quite possible that now something has fundamentally changed. But at the same time, there were reasons why China haven't sold any weapons to Russia before. If China starts doing that, that would severely undermine the whole Chinese diplomatic strategy with the European Union. And relations with Europe are important for the Chinese. So I have, and really I have contacts with my American colleagues who are also specializing in Chinese affairs. Many of them are also still doubtful about China's intention. It would be
All
just,
right, but what if China does, as you're saying, that there is a chance
if
that China
China
just
does.
right, it's China. If they do supply the weapons to Russia, how do you think that's going to be a game changer for this Ukraine
So
war?
yeah, if that happens, it will be a massive game changer. So the key factor in this war is that both Russia and NATO have found their industrial bases to be inadequate for this kind of wars. For a very long period of time, both Russians and the Americans, and even more Europeans, thought that this kind of large-scale, protracted conventional wars would be unlikely. It would be either counterinsurgency wars or nuclear wars. That was the common wisdom. That is why both Russian and American industrial bases, especially in areas like production of artillery ammunition, were quite modest by the beginning of this war. And currently, both sides are suffering from significant shortage of artillery ammunition. Like the whole NATO defense industry is working for Ukraine, but they cannot provide the necessary amount of artillery ammunition, and suffering from lack of artillery pieces, artillery guns, because they are being worn out or destroyed very quickly. And there are a number of other weapons which are not really high tech, but you need them in absolutely huge numbers in war like that. You need to constantly replace them. So
Right. What about? Yeah. Sorry, please carry on.
the Chinese have the greatest production capacity for these types of weapons in the world. They have greatest numbers of factories. They never followed the same global trend on scaling down their industry. And there are reasons to believe that if they start to ramp up production, they would be able to produce more artillery ammunition and more guns and armored vehicles than Russia and NATO combined. And there is another key factor, which is also a very important lesson of the Ukrainian war. Key technology which is used in Ukrainian war are small tactical UAVs. Like big UAVs, combat UAVs, proved to be not particularly important during this war because they're vulnerable to air defense. but the war is defined by absolutely huge numbers of small UAVs, quadricopters, which are being used for reconnaissance, targeting artillery, and you need them in absolutely huge numbers because they don't live for long. You need to constantly replace them. Now, China controls 70% of global commercial small UAV market. So it's like producer which is stronger than the whole rest of the world combined. So if Russia has them on its side, then of course there are reasons to believe that Russia will simply win, and relatively quickly.
Okay, so that seems to be a prospect that the West needs to deal with, and perhaps which is why they are so scared. And the West is literally spooked that that China might be in the there are some people that I spoke to from many analysts, global analysts who've been tracking the war. They Someone I spoke to just yesterday who said that the number of trains from Beijing to Moscow have, he's keeping a track and he's saying have been going up, and probably those weapons are already being supplied, although we don't know for sure right now. But as far as Russia is concerned, so far it was of course using its own defense equipment, and it had to rely on countries like Iran and North Korea. Also, there were reports of sending weapons to Russia. How does this help Russia? What kind of weaponry do you think they would need from China if China does agree to arm Russia in this Ukraine war?
So, first of all, what will be important, it would be artillery ammunition. China is the biggest producer of it. And many of the Chinese artillery systems have the same calibers, the same ammunition as the Russian artillery systems. You can just use them straight away. Artillery systems themselves, because China is the strongest producer of artillery systems in the world, like they beat everyone. And of course, UAVs of various types. Maybe if China is willing to really supply Russia in a major way, then short-range ballistic missiles would be very important, because you just can never get enough of them in wars like that. Basically, in this kind of war on attrition, you quickly have shortage of everything, and that applies to both sides, to Russians and to Ukrainians. So even stuff like Chinese armored vehicles would be quite useful for the Russians. So that's a country with probably strongest production capacity in the world, as far as we talk about ground forces weapons, army weapons, and basically we could find use for everything.
And hence your use of the word game changer. I understand. But tell me, what's in it for China? Because China is already, it has its own, it's now facing its own share of brickbats from the world, as far as various issues are concerned. There are trade problems with the US. There are already a lot of problems with Europe there, and in any case, there is the Taiwan issue, which is hanging fire, and with the US senators making a beeline to visit Taiwan, and starting with Nancy Pelosi last year. So, what is it that China gains from at this moment cozying up to Russia by giving a nod for transfer of arms, which it has not done so far?
Well, China's relations with the United States are evolving in the same direction as the Russia's relations with the United States. It's interesting that even while the Americans need some kind of Chinese cooperation on issues like Ukraine, they constantly continue to pressure the Chinese, provoke them on various issues like Taiwan. Just cannot stop it continue to impose new sanctions on the Chinese, like Biden administration constantly does that. So relations are deteriorating very quickly. Both sides, both Chinese and the Americans, consider the prospect of real war around Taiwan as absolutely realistic for the next several years. So there is real possibility that there will be war for Taiwan, and that will be a massive economic and political cataclysm, which will be much stronger than Ukraine. And the Chinese tried to smooth these relations with the Americans. They failed so far. So if Russia inflicts a massive military and political defeat on the United States in Ukraine, like in this kind of, because Ukrainian war is not war between Russia and Ukraine, it's a proxy war between Russia and the United States and some of the US allies. So if Russia inflicts defeat on them, that will be the beginning of the end of the old world order. Like US will lose credibility, and militarily, the war already has tremendous consequences for the situation in Asia, because there are so many resources which are concentrated by the Americans in Europe. There are already massive delays in arms shipments to Taiwan because all resources are dedicated to Ukraine. Basically, the assistance to Ukraine, just what is given to the Ukrainians, is now by now amounts like to something like $140 billion combined American and European expenses. But on top of that, you have huge expenses on operating American forces in Eastern Europe, like more than 100,000 people, constant use of reconnaissance equipment. So the war costs like several times more than compared to Iraqi war or global war on terror. And the costs are high. The American resources are not unlimited, and the Chinese understand that. And if in the end of the day, Russia just defeats the Americans in Ukraine, then it's quite likely that Chinese will not even need to risk any kind of major military operation to kick the Americans out of Western Pacific.
Okay, so you think, you talked about a world order. Do you believe that there is a new world order which is emerging out of this conflict with Russia and China on one side, and the West and the Europe, the US and the Europe on the other?
Not necessarily. Quite clearly, that is the beginning of the end of the old world order. That's for sure, because what the Ukrainian war has shown us, that first the United States and Europe failed to deter Russia from starting this military operation, and second, Russia, in spite of many like purely military tactical setbacks, Russia was capable to fight for a year and continues to fight. And that's a kind of big change, and it's changing the basic assumptions of many global players. If this war continues for a longer time, consumes more American resources, taking into account the fact the Americans have to care about many issues and Russians have just Ukraine, and ends with American defeat, then we have a new situation. American credibility suffers. They are not a hegemon anymore. They are still a strong power. Russia and China will work combined to weaken them, but it's important to understand that Russian-Chinese partnership is mostly about countering the United States. Russia doesn't want to be completely tied up with the Chinese, especially in Asian politics, because for Russia it's very important to maintain relations with India, with Vietnam, with a number of other countries. And basically, progress in Russian-Indian trade relations last year was also very significant. Of course,
Significant.
absolutely, we had extremely fast growth of our trade. India was a major importer of Russian oil, made very good business out of it because Indians were paying for oil with huge discounts, like sometimes $30 per barrel. So India made a lot of money out of it, but Russia also managed to diversify its external ties and stabilize its finances.
Right. You talked about India. How do you, and let me probably end on that note. How do you see India's um, uh, position in this new axis that seems to be developing between Russia and China? Because India
I
has
believe,
its own concerns as far as China is concerned.
yeah, I believe India has taken a very well calculated line. Indian policy is very effective. India is not engaging into any kind of is not siding with anyone, but India is using this situation first to improve its relations with the West, and because the West needs Indian cooperation, and at the same time stabilize relations with China, and at the same time India is boosting relations with Russia, ensuring that the Chinese cannot use their connection with Russia against India. And what is happening now, we have growth in trade, but we also have a process of Indian businesses taking some of the segments of the Russian market which are abandoned by the Europeans, and there are plenty of opportunities for that because car market is abandoned, pharmaceuticals, many others. The Chinese are working very fast to take it over, but Russia is not actually interested in this kind of monopolization, and there are plenty of opportunities for Indian producers of industrial equipment, cars, medical equipment, and some steps are already being made, as far as I understand.
Some steps are already being made, and to that effect, how do you see India? What sort of a role do you see for India? I mean, yes, that's definitely there. That's a lot of people are talking about that. But when Xi Jinping comes to Moscow, that's probably expected for early March or in April next year. How do you see that entire? Because the West will be definitely spooked, and there's also talks about Xi Jinping trying to broker a peace as far as this war is concerned, and talking to Putin and the West. Do you see that taking place? Do you see that? Do you see any chances of that happening?
The Chinese are going to propose their initiative for resolving the Ukrainian crisis, and I believe that initiative will be welcomed by the Russians because the initiative actually calls, it's based on Chinese position on Ukrainian crisis, which is we need to start negotiations immediately. We advocate early ceasefire, and at the same time, we understand that everyone's security concerns need to be taken into account, including Russia's security concerns. And no one should export weapons into the war zone, and sanctions are not useful. So all of this is very good for Russia. Russia would accept it. Russia always said that Russia is ready to negotiate anytime. And the Ukrainians were refusing to negotiate. Ukrainians and their Western supporters were saying that negotiations are only possible after Russia withdraws the troops. Russia is ready to negotiate anytime. So I believe that likely Chinese initiative is something which Russia will be able to easily accept, start negotiating. The Ukrainians will refuse. But China will show its active role in this conflict, and
And
that would.
that's perhaps this entire talk about the April 2022 peace deal, which had been brokered by the then Israeli Prime Minister. That sort of was nixed, he said, by the Western powers because they did not want a peace deal brokered. They wanted a regime change, perhaps in Russia, and that's
Of course,
let's
yeah.
see how.
Uh,
Yes, let's see how the initiative by China and Xi Jinping's visit. Let's see how that plays out and how those negotiations take place. But you're perhaps right. Probably, in all probability, Ukraine is going to reject any chance or any talk about a peace deal now, because I think that is what Zelensky has been saying for the longest time. It's now victory or defeat, and they're very confident of a victory, given the kind of arms and ammunition that they have been promised by the West and that have been flowing in already.
Well, yeah, they try to project confidence because if they don't, they might lose everything pretty quickly. The war is not going as well for Ukrainians as it is described in the Western media. And the Ukrainian human losses are absolutely horrendous, and there is huge destruction of infrastructure and economy. So what the Ukrainian government is doing, they're constantly trying to project this image of close victory. In reality, and I understand that from my contacts with some of the American colleagues and reading, there is not much hope, even in the US, that Ukraine might win. What they are trying to do is to prevent Ukrainians from losing the war completely, from collapsing. So what they are hoping for is that Russians are completely stalled, cannot advance anymore, and then there is some kind of agreement between Russia and basically with the US, because no one is going to really talk with the Ukrainians. They're not taking any decisions. And
All right, so
that
that's
is
interesting.
that's basically
Interesting.
that's confirmed by Naftali Bennett's interview. Like everything was negotiated, but then the US and the UK intervened and told the Ukrainians to actually continue fighting. So why is it so? Because even if you look at the Ukraine's budget for this year, like 60% of budget income is supposed to come from foreign loans and grants. So they are capable to finance their expenses but just at maximum by 40%, but probably in reality even less. Like the situation is such that once the Western assistance stops, Ukraine falls probably in a couple of weeks at maximum.
I want you to just talk about also the pushback that the Ukrainians seem to have given Russia in over the last several weeks. There is a renewed onslaught by Russia now, but the last several months, all we've been hearing about was the pushback from the Ukrainian side. So it's not
So
all one way. It's the
yeah,
battlefield, isn't it?
absolutely. So the key issue about the war in Ukraine, what we need to understand, that it's seen as very long war on attrition between Russia and the United States, and the key issue for Russia is actually not to gain some territory or something, but to maintain pressure on Ukraine, deplete Ukrainian resources, while keeping Russian economy stable. That is why for the first half a year, Russia has been even for the first, I would say, like 7 to 8 months. What Russia was fighting was a kind of expeditionary war, which meant that only part of the military forces are sent to the battlefield. The forces all volunteer, any member of the force has legal right to break contract and go home, which many of them did. And some resources are not being used. Basically, Russia managed to keep budget deficit in the first year of war at level of something like 2%, which is unheard of for a country in war. And the expenses were also kept very modest. But by August, September, this model came to crisis because the Russians couldn't boost number of their manpower in Ukraine. They constantly have like 3-4 times less soldiers on the battlefield than the Ukrainians, and they tried to compensate for that by heavy use of artillery. But you cannot fight like that indefinitely. Russians simply had at some point something like 150,000 soldiers on the whole theater, and Ukrainians they stated close to 1 million, but of course they never had 1 million active on the front lines, but still several times more than the Russians. And the Russians hoped to keep operating like that for as long as possible, and they miscalculated severely because it was a dangerous game, and they lost this territory in Kharkiv. And after that, they had to retrench, and start partial mobilization. So Russians mobilized 300,000 troops, and what is more important, they forbade people already serving in the army to break contracts. Like previously, you could break contracts, refuse go to war. Now, if you break contracts, you don't go to home, you go to jail. So now that changed the dynamics, but the key point for Russia is not taking territory, because taking territory solves nothing, because the Ukrainian industrial base, Ukrainian economic base is not in Ukraine. Everything is provided by Europe. So you need to gradually destroy the Ukrainian army, which means you need to grind the Ukrainian manpower. And second, you need to gradually destroy the infrastructure, because these are two things which cannot be replaced by the West. So the whole Russian strategy is keeping protracted war and inflict maximum losses. And of course, you should never believe the claims of each side when they say we killed that many. You just ignore it. But there are some facts about the situation in Ukraine, and we know about that from Ukrainian media. And these facts suggest that there are some extreme measures for additional mobilization being taken by the Ukrainian government. For example, they forbade the boys of 16 and 17 years old to leave the country. Like now, officially, the age of conscription is 18, but they are forbidding these boys to leave the country. They started to mobilize people who were not mobilized before, like policemen, local officials. They started to, in some cases, to mobilize women which have certain professions. And that fact suggests that human losses are already rather severe, and there are certain limits to human resources. So this is hard evidence. We don't know how much people has been killed. There are some efforts to calculate, but they are not particularly reliable. But the resources on the Ukrainian side are much more limited.
All right, very fascinating to hear from you. Very fascinating to hear things that are happening in the battlefield, and we'd love to hear more from you. Right now, of course, our focus was on China, but we, of course, digressed to the present state of the battlefield, and I think that was an extension. One was the extension of other, but we'd love to hear from you more. Especially when the Chinese premier is in Moscow, and ahead of that, and your perspective on how China and this whole bogey about China supplying weapons to Ukraine, and you are right, that could be the definite game changer as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned. Thank you so much for joining us today, and Mr. Kashin, and we'd love to hear from you again to get this perspective and to understand what's happening in the battlefield, even though we are sitting very, very far.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, viewers watching this broadcast. Stay tuned to Hindustan Times. We'll come back to you with more.